Has your network been breached? Cybereason can help you answer this question. Cybereason products hunt for threats within your network and eliminate them in real time. To Cybereason, real time means within seconds. Founded by former military hackers who don't play by the rules, they've built this experience into their platform. Harness ingenuity and imagination, not just code, to defeat attackers. Cybereason, disrupt the adversary and let the hunt begin. Endgame automates the hunt for both known and never-before-seen adversaries in enterprise networks. Built on unique knowledge on the adversary's tools, techniques, and tactics, Endgame's centrally managed agent prevents, detects, and responds to advanced adversaries in the earliest stages of the kill chain without prior knowledge. Endgame, automate the hunt. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Ted Demidopoulos is here with us, as well as Joff and Jeff. I want to set the stage for inevitably what is our first topic for this evening, which is going to be about the Equifax breach. And I just want to define either end of the spectrum as I've been reading much about this breach. There are some that believe, kind of on one side, that are not ignoring, but basically pushing aside some of the other issues and saying, look, Equifax was a company that collected your personal information and sold it to and shared it with other organizations, and this breach is just an extension of your information being shared out to these other sources, so what's the hoopla? The other kind of end of the argument, not necessarily an opposite end of the spectrum, but the other kind of extreme argument I've heard is, well, the Apache Struts vulnerability that purportedly was the source of the breach is really just kind of a smoke and mirrors game being played by Equifax. That is, there are other fundamental issues with the security program and architecture at Equifax, and by blaming either a zero-day or late-breaking Struts vulnerability, some said 9-year-old vulnerability, there was refutes on that, but basically the Struts vulnerability is smoke and mirrors, that there were other fundamental issues with the architecture at Equifax that ultimately led to this breach. The other kind of angle also that I think is, I don't know, can be debated is that the security officers and information security or information IT officers at Equifax sold their stock shortly before the breach. That's been a hotly debated topic as well. I personally find it hard to believe that a breach of this magnitude could have not been known by those executives at the company, although some argue the date at which Mandiant and FireEye were brought into Equifax to help recover from the breach would be very telling if we knew when, as to the knowledge that those executives would have had before they sold the stock. Then there's also the legal aspect as well. What do we do? Is there a class action lawsuit and all of those kinds of issues? Those are some of the first two extremes and other two kind of angles on the issue. I want to turn it over to the panel of folks. Jeff, why don't you start us off on some of your thoughts on this breach?
Yeah, so let me start, and it's sort of touching on, I guess, the second side that you mentioned, sort of the smoke and mirrors aspect that the Apache vulnerability, was what was blamed, but there's other systemic issues. So, everybody knows I have a PCI background, and when I first heard about the breach, there was a mention in terms of all the other PII that was compromised. There was also credit card numbers. So if there's credit card numbers involved, that means that in theory, Equifax is a merchant and is supposed to be PCI compliant. And so,
hold on, Jeff. Are they a merchant, or like, is there a differentiator between a merchant and someone who is storing credit card information for purposes of credit investigation?
That's a good question, and that's a good. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Mm.
So, to my knowledge, I have never gone to Equifax or any of the other credit card reporting agencies and done the stuff that they do. So, somebody tell me if you're participating in that exercise, and I guess that's one part, or what information do they collect in general about your credit history, since they're a credit reporting agency? You know, to what degree do they collect things like your credit card number?
Right.
I would like to think that as a credit reporting agency, they're going to have more information about, like, you have a Visa with Bank America, you have a MasterCard through, you know, down the street bank, whatever, and not necessarily
The
the
number.
account numbers.
Right.
But I was looking at their website earlier today, and there is a portion where you can pay for your credit report.
Right.
And I haven't clicked through because they wanted you to fill out your name, address, and social security number.
Oh,
I wasn't going to go there. But I'm assuming
Mhm.
that at some point when it says for $15.95 you can buy a credit report, that they're going to accept credit card for
Yep.
payment. So it's not to, it's so, there's so many issues here, but they said that there was 209,000 credit card numbers compromised out of 143 million accounts, let's say. That sort of implies to me probably either one of a couple things. One, that most of the people that are using the services don't pay by credit card. They just do the free stuff, the free reporting. I have a hunch that probably what was done, since the exploit was through a web application, that maybe they set up some sort of harvesting. Either 209,000 was all the credit cards that they had for all of their customers, which I think sounds like a little bit low, or it was harvesting over 3 months compared to 143 million customers.
No, it's good insight. Yep.
That probably sounds a little bit more feasible. But that's why I say they're a merchant. They're accepting credit cards as payment for purchase of credit card reporting. And this is a guess. I don't know this as a fact, but that's probably the 209,000 cards that were compromised was probably some sort of collection harvesting through the web application.
In the 143 million, Jeff, is information that the consumer is not giving up, but when you go apply for some sort of credit, a car is a perfect example, that whoever you're applying for that credit is going to Equifax and requesting information and or giving you information to get back information.
Right. So Equifax and the other credit reporting agencies are collecting credit information on U.S. citizens. I don't know how they divide them up. I don't know if they do all citizens times 3, because there's 3 major brands. But they're collecting the information. It's not all information that's provided by the consumer. You or I going to their website and saying, I want to get my credit report. Here's some basic information or dispute information. So, that notwithstanding, let's start with, they were a merchant. They should have been doing PCI.
Right.
Taking PCI, the data security standard, as a framework, there's 12 major requirements. And I was thinking through this in preparation for today, and I'll try to get through it as quickly as possible. And there's 12 major requirements, and I was kind of going through them in my head, which were the ones that were okay. They didn't do that. Requirement 1, very quickly, is the building a secure network. That's where you talk about having a firewall rules, access control lists, restricted access, both ingress and egress. And I'm thinking, okay, that's a fail, because the attackers were exfiltrating data somehow. That shouldn't have happened. Requirement 2, not so much. Requirement 3 is the need to encrypt data at rest. So they've got all this information. So 2 things. The PII data, I'm not aware of any regulatory compliance requirement that says you have to encrypt PII data. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, GDPR in Europe might
in the future
require that, correct?
Now, There's no requirement that I'm aware of that says you have to encrypt PII. Credit card information is supposed to be encrypted. Let's say they were doing that. That again makes me think that maybe that the 209,000 that were compromised because of some sort of harvesting. Depending on what the harvesting is, as soon as those credit card numbers are entered, if you're paying for something, it's supposed to be encrypted. Magically as soon as it happened. Of course, there's always a window when that process has to happen. But again, to me that kind of points towards it was probably a harvesting. But applying the PCI standard as a framework, PII data probably should have been encrypted. Maybe it was, but maybe it was using drive file system encryption that's kind of transparent to the user, and maybe the hackers were assuming privileges of a
also,
user.
Jeff, back to requirement 1, having firewalls and protections to prevent against exfiltrating data. If it was a web application vulnerability and they were exfiltrating data over means that were meant to transfer that information, it could conceivably bypass those firewall protections.
Well, not necessarily bypass, but in theory, the egress firewall rules are supposed to allow 443. So if they were good attackers, which they probably were, they were probably using 443 and encrypted, tunneling the data out, which we'll get back to when we start walking through some of the rest of the requirements. But yeah, you're right. Also, I should mention on requirement 1, just sort of as a placeholder, you're supposed to have an inventory of all your systems and all your applications. So keep note of that. So
who does that?
Skip 2, got 3. The encryption 4 is encryption in flight, not really an issue. 5 is antivirus and malware, not necessarily an issue. Requirement 6, big one. Requirement 6 is where you have secure software development, and you have the change management and the patch management, the vulnerability management, where basically, and I'm paraphrasing, PCI says you need to have, as an organization, sources of vulnerability data so that you're on top of vulnerabilities when they're announced. And PCI requires you to patch critical security vulnerabilities within 30 days of the release. So, early March, I think, is when the patch came out. So in theory, they should have been patching by early April. So that's something we should talk about later. But let me get through it all, and then we'll go back and discuss. Also, in requirement 6 is the idea for secure coding. Obviously they didn't know that Apache had that vulnerability, but they should have updated it. They should have been testing the patch. They should have been going through their test environment, making sure it didn't work. I suspect a lot of excuses that I've heard from customers over the years of why not patching, why they didn't implement a patch, is because they feared or it did break software. So that's probably going to be an excuse. I haven't read anything specifically, but I've seen some articles saying that they're starting to point fingers with the different software that they were using. But the bottom line is they should have had it updated within 30 days of release. Most of the companies that I worked with over the years as a QSA, they actually had policies in the companies to do critical patches within 7 days, if not sooner. So that was always a big deal. So that's sort of to me the big wow. It's hard to argue that one. But let's move on. 7, access control, not so much. 8, the user, password strength and all that kind of stuff. Probably not so much. If the hacker's on a box, he's going to elevate privileges. 7 and 8 doesn't a whole lot apply. 9 is physical security. Interesting note, a friend of mine that's an industry reporter tweeted out today that he found the KPMG SOC audit report. Apparently Equifax had it public and was available for viewing, a SOC 1 Type 2 audit report, which some people may have been able to grab a copy of. And we can talk about that later. But otherwise, physical security, not so much. Requirement 10, that's a big one. That's the logging and monitoring requirement. Hacker breaks in, does something, exploits a vulnerability. He's doing all sorts of activity, presumably to exfiltrate data. There should have been alerts going off. There should have been logging of administrative activity, assuming that they had to elevate their privileges to do some of the things they did. Requirement 10 is kind of a big deal. Requirement 11, which is all the security testing like vulnerability scanning and pen testing. Vulnerability scanning, I could almost give them a pass on, and not just because this is sort of the industry norm. And I suspect, and this goes back to our time at Tenable, I suspect that a lot of companies rely on their vulnerability notification being when their scan engine gets updated and their scan, whatever their next periodic scan is, reports the discovery of the vulnerability. So there's some wiggle room in there if they're only scanning quarterly, which is what PCI requires, although most companies would scan monthly to try to get a clean scan once a quarter and so on and so forth. But so there's a little bit of wiggle room there.
Yeah, I don't agree with that necessarily, but
Well, we can argue that. There's also a requirement to scan after significant changes. So about the vulnerability, it's a 10 on the criticality ranking.
yeah,
You try to fix everything. For the love of God, scan everything to make sure you caught
make
everything.
sure you fix it.
That is a requirement to scan after a significant change. And I would argue that trying to patch a 10 critical vulnerability is kind of a significant change. Pen testing, once a year or twice a year, that's probably not going to be an issue. Intrusion detection. Intrusion detection probably should have been catching some of this activity, and logs from intrusion detection should have been reviewed, and that should have, that's going back to requirement 10, the logging and monitoring. There's supposed to be daily review of the logs. It should have been caught. So that's 10, 11,
Yeah,
12.
I think intrusion detection, as we think about it in a modern sense, Jeff, when it comes to web applications, I think that's a big deal in my assessment of the security market today. There are web application detection and prevention technologies that definitely would have alerted them to the breach. Varying degrees of success. However, I really think that when specific to web applications, we've really come a long way, and a lot of organizations are lagging behind in that web application protection and detection functionality.
Well, then maybe we haven't come a long way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Finally, requirement 12
ahead,
is the section that talks about having an incident response plan, and it talks about notification. Now, if you look at the timeline, this is one of the first things that I noticed that I was kind of like scratching my head over. You already mentioned the fact that the executives sold stock after the breach was reportedly detected, which in my mind, if that's true, that's criminal and they should be prosecuted. But they reported detection of the breach. If you believe what you're seeing in the reporting, it was discovered in help me out. It happened in May. It was discovered in, somebody tell me when it was. I'm blanking.
A month or so after, roughly?
It's like a month, 2 or 3.
A little more than a month.
If you do the math,
July
I think it was July, and 40 days elapsed between when I think it was like July 29th, and between that and the announcement publicly early September, there was like 40 days that elapsed. And the big brouhaha a couple years ago with the Target and the Home Depot breaches, and the legislation that went into Congress that I don't think ever passed was all about breach notification within 30 days. 40 days is longer than 30 days. Now, did they notify the card brands, which is what they should have done under PCI, and they got in forensics investigators? Maybe they did all that. But, I think we can all agree that their PR plan for handling this breach has been lacking. Not necessarily.
Well, not lacking, also just off. I think not.
Yeah.
Off. I agree.
So, to summarize, yes, I think like in most breaches, we sort of point at the specific, well, there was a specific vulnerability and they should have patched it and they were 17 days late in patching it or whatever. But usually what is the case is there's this breakdown, and it's usually a systemic breakdown in a whole lot of different little things that add up to a breach. Lack of attention to the different processes, lack of understanding, lack of a cultural concern, and sort of a cultural embracing of security. That's where I've seen some of the conversations going, just in terms of how do you do cybersecurity in a company. How do you make it part of the culture and not just running out and buying a new device that has a different color blinky lights and so you can say you're good.
Well, I think it really comes down to the development environment, in my opinion. One of the critical things that in analyzing this breach is their reliance on Apache struts and server-side Java, which is a older technology, which has suffered from many, many vulnerabilities, which I also believe has significant challenges in terms of updating. And I speak from experience. I speak from the experience on this issue. Joff, I don't know, and Ted and Jeff, I don't know if you've experienced server-side Java development. I did a lot of that in 2001, 2002. When you update the Java server-side framework, it's a huge deal. Like, developers revolt. Like, I'm talking pitchforks and just
it
like
is a huge deal.
Awful. It's a huge deal. It impacts your code greatly. So reliance in 2017 on that architecture without a modern DevOps environment put you at a significant disadvantage to having your environment and your architecture be resilient to a lot of these security incidents. And we talked about this. We touched on it on Enterprise Security Weekly this week, and it's something I've been harping on recently. I think it's really bad. I think in 2001, it was great. Server-side Java, awesome, right? Now we have a lot more frameworks, even more in terms of containers and DevOps that allow us to develop at a faster pace, to roll out patches at a faster pace. And a lot of these older organizations that are stuck in this legacy technology haven't moved into the newer movements that allow you to react faster to changes that make you update your entire server-side environment and do that in a very expedient, efficient, and without downtime. And Joff, I know you've done a lot of development on this front. I mean, what are your thoughts on some of these legacy enterprises? You've done a lot of application testing too, right? How do you get some of these legacy enterprises to move to this new technology so they can update faster?
Well, let me interject before Jeff responds.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I agree with what you're saying, Paul, but I was at a conference earlier this week that was an incident response conference, and DevOps came up. And call me naive and call me a hopelessly old-timer curmudgeon, but I have yet to have a conversation with anybody that proclaims to be an expert or a firm believer in DevOps when I ask the question, where does security enter into DevOps? Do I ever get a straight answer, if any answer at all? So,
well, it's part of the process.
I defer to Joff now.
It's part of the process. Joff, go ahead.
Well, in all of this conversation, I love the way Jeff broke it down, first of all, from the PCI perspective, which is, completely appropriate given what we're dealing with. There's a couple of points that I was thinking about as you were breaking that down. And first of all, one is kind of related to what Paul was saying. On the surface, and again, we're speculating because I don't know the details, but this seems like an architectural design kind of issue as well. I mean, one has to wonder out loud, how does that much data get breached without somebody noticing that the back-end databases are delivering a ton of stuff to the front end, which is subsequently, compromised and leaking out all this stuff? Was the back-end database part of the front end? Were these things tied together in the same application? Was there appropriate defense in depth? There's a lot of questions that come to mind as you're talking around it. So that's one thing. And Paul, I think you were circling around this architectural kind of issues that may be out of date. And again, it's all speculation, so just our listeners, take that for what it's worth. The other part that really, really bothers me here is a little bit different, and that is when we as individual citizens or U.S. persons, and by the way, Jeff, it is a U.S. person, not just a citizen, that is potentially affected. I got a Social Security number way before I was ever a citizen, and I'm damn sure I had a credit record at that time too. When a person gets that Social Security number and starts doing business in the United States, they never know that they have given permission at all, and they don't implicitly or explicitly give permission for these agencies to start collecting data on them. And yet, in most other walks of life that we deal with as day-to-day individuals, we are interacting with the business, and we do have the knowledge that we're giving out information. These credit reporting agencies are fundamentally different in that sense, and seems like there's not a level of accountability to all of the people whose data has been breached, because they, in most cases, never even knew that this was being collected on them.
Ted, I want to put you on the spot because you've been doing consulting for quite some time. When you encounter an organization that is very heavily reliant on Java EE or J2EE, right, the enterprise edition of Java, one, do they have security concerns? And two, do you have like your set list of recommendations on how they can move off of that platform and adopt some of these newer technologies that I believe are more resilient from a security standpoint and allow for faster maintenance and more resiliency?
Well, I was struck by it. Sounded they just had such a backwards, ancient architecture and technologies. Now, I realize old technologies never go away and legacy stuff exists forever. A year and a half ago, I had a client, I don't know what they're still doing, but they're still running literally mission critical stuff on DOS, the Chinese version, not the latest version, and moving stuff around via SneakerNet at the end of the day, which probably was actually
using
pretty
8-inch
secure.
floppies.
Well, I liken Java to the new COBOL. It's kind of where I framed it on a show this week.
That is a great way to put it. And you have to realize it is very difficult for them to move away from something they have that does work. And I remember one very large development project I was involved in. I was the embedded security guy in the development project, and we were replacing something that was so old that, and you've heard this before, but they were buying used parts on eBay for their hardware.
Yep.
And when we finally came up with a new system, and it was a technical success, we built something awesome, the executives would not turn it on. They wouldn't turn it on and decommission the old system. Now, my consulting engagement ended there, and I don't know what they've done, but we see this a lot. And I think what a lot of this boils down to is there's both no understanding, and there doesn't have to be from the top, because there's no accountability. There is no understanding that this old stuff needs to be updated at some time. There's going to be some pain in moving to a more modern, and in my mind, more modern means more resilient, more capable of being or likely to be secure environment. So I was struck. It's like, man, they're running old stuff. But then it was like, well, it's hard to get away from the old stuff.
Oh, yeah. But there are benefits, Ted, and I think it speaks to your communications message, right? I think that developers might stick with it because that's what they know, right? Security and even infrastructure or software architects that are kind of extrapolated from the development might say, hey, there's a better way to do this, and here are the benefits. But some of the breakdown is in communications. But even if your communications are awesome, there are the business people that are like, well, no, I still don't see the justification for this technology expenditure to say, let's move from Java, from server-side Java, which is great technology, don't get me wrong, but let's move to this new architecture. And while you might take a dip, right, maybe in profits, maybe in productivity, but coming out of it, you're going to be much higher on both those scales and being more resilient and being more maintainable and being faster, and there's all these benefits, but they can't see that because all they can see is that dip in productivity that's going to happen before you get there.
I want to point out that there is a workforce training issue here too.
Mm-hmm.
Leading public universities, and I know this because my daughter's in college right now.
They learn Java.
They are
still.
teaching Java as their 101 computer science programming class.
Java was a new course when I took it in college, Joff. It was very exciting.
Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. It is still being taught.
Yeah.
I
I'm
learned
old.
Java 2 years ago because my son was taking a Java class.
Mm-hmm.
He was taking supposedly a cutting-edge programming class. He was taking it in the summer because he wanted to, which was pretty cool. And I was traveling a lot, and he was calling me around 11 or 12 at night, and I was doing JOT, Java over the telephone. Never having written a line of Java in my life, but I've written enough code. It wasn't that hard. And it was being portrayed as this is the new thing, and this was not that long ago.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the professor teaching it wasn't an old fossil like myself either. It was a young guy.
Well, so I think there we have a combination industry and training problem, right?
Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I think, Paul, part of the problem, I think we've talked about this before, is, we're sort of in the middle of this paradigm shift where in the industrial age, we got accustomed to, buying products that would last for 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
It's true.
And the better products that cost more were the ones that would last longer. And we're still having a problem, and, in a lot of management, although, everybody's getting older and younger people are getting in, but, from an economic perspective, there's still this tendency to want to invest in things that are going to last a long time and get the most usage out of it. So this whole concept of, having to update and change architectures and refresh, even versions of things like, Apache, which are a big deal, and doing it fairly frequently are still sort of intuitively foreign ideas to, I think, a lot of the people that are in management positions, and older people like us. The idea that you have to, do a wholesale refresh of your entire application and all the architecture behind it on a relatively frequent basis versus, and I know you said you used to work for a company that produced, checkout, self-checkout machines using AS400. AS400, how old is that? It works. People are used to, well, it works. Why not keep using it as long as possible? And so that's not to excuse anything, but I think there needs to, part of the communication is understanding there's this paradigm shift that we haven't gotten used to. And companies are tired of spending all the money on all the security solutions, and you're telling them they have to refresh the technology and
that's a great point,
all the
Jeff.
architectures.
Yeah.
There's some point where companies just kind of throw up their hands. It works. I'll take the risk.
Yeah.
I don't understand everything that you're saying, but it's working, and I don't want to spend the money. Why should I spend the money? And then you get every once in a while.
Jeff just hit a grand slam, though. That's a grand slam, Jeff, because we make those recommendations. We're like, look, you can't be using server-side Java technologies because they're old or antiquated. There's deserialization bugs all over the place. We've proven that through JBoss, through struts. We've seen that in the market where Oracle has stopped support for some of their enterprise Java products and pushing that off onto open source, and who knows what the security is going to be. And we're saying, by the way, you need to adopt all these new security practices that go inside of your development in the early stages and go all the way into your detection and protection stages. You need to adopt those, and all that costs money. And what Jeff is saying is, people just want shit that works, right? And it's a huge struggle. It's a huge. I agree.
And to extend on that just a little bit, the idea that the new stuff has figured out how to fix all the problems of the old stuff. While that's true, I've been around long enough, and Ted hopefully would agree with me, that even all the new technologies just wait a while, give it time. Somebody's going to figure out how that's incredibly broken too, and then we're going to, lather, rinse, and repeat and do this all over again. That's kind of the nature of what we've gotten ourselves into as a society. We've embraced technology, and technology is inherently broken, and we fix it and find improvements, and then in a little while, somebody smarter than all of us figures out how to break the new stuff, and we got to do it all over again.
Yeah, I
It
agree.
makes
I
you
look at
wonder.
it partially as, somebody's got a building and it's a painted building and the paint's still fine and it looks new and there's nothing wrong with it. You tell them it has to be repainted because the old paint isn't secure anymore, or it's lacking something. They kind of look at it, it's like it works, it's there, it's paint, it looks new to me, it's functional.
Right.
And part of it may be that technology is just moving too quickly right now.
Well, and along those lines, that's a great segue. But that's a great segue. I loved our take on the Equifax breach. I thought it was unique. Thank everyone. I think that's great. Talking about new, air quotes, new technology, we talk about Apple's facial recognition. Now, much of the feedback that I've seen, and myself included, having done this show for 13 years, a lot of really smart people have come on the show as guests. A lot of really smart people have come on the show as hosts. And I remember, like back in time when we talked about facial technology, I can remember Twitchy and others going, well, this particular technology is facial recognition. And all I have to do is find a picture of them on social media, print it out, and I can hold it up to their device, and it'll do the facial recognition. And if that's not good enough, I can get a picture on my phone or device or tablet or whatever and hold it up, and it'll do the recognition. And we largely, I think, as a security community, dismissed facial recognition as valid technology that would solve this problem. Here comes Apple with their announcement, and I don't think that the new iPhone is really what Apple's announcement was all about. And I'll talk about what really I felt from a business perspective is really Apple's kind of golden ticket to their next category creation. But in security, we're talking about facial technology, right? And there's a debate like your eyes need to be open for this. And if it fails more than 3 times or whatever, it falls back to a fingerprint. And I think the whole idea of authenticating to your device that's based on your face or whatever it's based on is under scrutiny, very much so. And for Apple to come out and say that facial recognition is where we think the technology is, and we as Apple have perfected this technology such that it's going to work. Do you guys think on the panel that this is a valid way to authenticate to your device? And what are your thoughts on whether Apple is able to pull this off in a secure manner or not?
I'll start by saying, and I don't have a good answer for this, but I think our industry, our society needs to come to terms with what's the difference between corporate security and consumer security. So to answer your question, I would think facial recognition from a consumer perspective up to a point is probably okay.
Good enough.
Good enough in certain applications. When it starts bleeding into the corporate environment and it's a facial recognition to get access to, not that anybody has a server room anymore or a lab environment or whatever, probably not a good idea, but, wait a few years, it'll be universally adopted and we'll move on.
You have the very same view that I was talking with Tom Parker, I think, from Accenture. Very similar view, Jeff, right? Consumer technology is different from enterprise security. However, there's a lot of, and when we talk to data scientists, such as Hiram from Endgame, right? When we had that interview earlier in the year, he was like, there's people working on, like, based on your behaviors, the software can authenticate you based on your facial expression. Now, this goes beyond just facial recognition. I'm talking about maybe your facial expressions, the way that you hold your phone, your certain gestures that you have with your phone. Based on your behaviors, machine learning can basically make the decision as to whether or not you should be authenticated to your device. There are many organizations and companies looking at this particular technology as a valid way to authenticate you, right? But I think you're right, Jeff. It's separated out from consumer. I want to get access to my phone, whether that's my fingerprint or my facial recognition, probably doesn't matter. From an enterprise perspective, it does matter, and there are other newer methods that companies are looking into. And I think there's going to be a company that gets it right that likely is going to be the de facto standard for authentication to these mechanisms. Now, whether that's a multi-factor or not, I think is a big kind of what if. I certainly, as a security professional, would like to see a multi-step type of authentication. Like, it's great if, based on my gestures and my movements, you can figure out that's Paul, that's the way Paul operates, so we're going to authenticate Paul as Paul. However, there needs to be some other form of authentication before, like you said, Jeff, I get access to the server room, I get access to a certain level of data. So I think we need to look at the problem differently and not just authentication is authentication. I think there's authentication to one level, and there's a second step to get to the next level, I think is the more likely scenario in this case. However, there's a lot of debate over whether Apple's technology is going to be resilient to the attacks that we all know and love, right? I mean, there's always been the like Play-Doh style attack or silly putty, right, to the fingerprint reader. There's always been the I'm going to print out a picture of you because I can find you on social media and do your facial recognition. We'll see if Apple can be resilient to those basic style attacks. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's a really good thing.
But again, I think it boils down to the good enough aspect of, from a consumer versus enterprise perspective. Even with two-factor authentication, there is goodbye, Paul. He must be thirsty.
Good guess, Jeff.
Right. You got the right model.
I know Paul.
You'd be authenticated as me if you knew my behaviors.
We've spooned together. Yeah, so maybe we need to have an authentication process that's tied to our taste buds and what alcohol we put in our mouth.
Yeah.
Paul would never drink that.
That's right.
So, I've got.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, I just have to. The one comment and the one part that bothers me. I first of all love the fact that technology is advancing. I love the idea of facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, all those things are great. But the one part that bothers me is these biological aspects, these biometric aspects, is stuff that you cannot change. So if you have a hash of my fingerprint, for example, that's not going to change.
I saw a really funny meme, Joff, that said, hey, we're going to implement facial technology, facial recognition as a form of authentication. And by the way, every 90 days, you need to modify your facial features so that it changes every 90 days, right?
Right.
The Plastic Surgeons Union is lobbying for that.
Absolutely.
But so what I was going to say was, when it comes to two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, when there was just a little Twitter storm going on about it that I was kind of sort of halfway paying attention to. And I'm asking this question in all seriousness to any of us on the panel. Is there in reality anything beyond the something you have, something you know, or something you are? Has there ever been anything else introduced than those three elements? And can there be? Is there anything other than those three elements when it comes to two-factor or multi-factor authentication?
I think Paul actually just said it, and that it was kind of that human bodily gestures, which is almost like something you do, right? Or something
you are, right? I think to speak to Jeff's point, right?
I guess it fits into that. It's a habitual thing. I find it hard that there is something beyond those things to conceptualize right now. But the one thing that I do find very important, certainly on the enterprise, I use that word drink. I mean, on the not consumer level, I think the concept of multi-factor is going to continue to be very, very important.
Now, it's interesting. We talk about the iPhone 8 and the iPhone X, and specifically the facial recognition. I think that in terms of a business differentiator for Apple, the ability to have LTE on my watch is a huge deal. I think it was the biggest announcement that Apple made. I think it's a game changer for the wearable devices. There very well could have been or are in existence today watches that have an LTE connection. The fact that Apple is doing that and making that available on their platform and their ecosystem, making it user-friendly for people, I think is a big deal. I think is also security concerns for us in the enterprise and for those of us in research that there is a wearable that has its own internet connection now beyond Wi-Fi and Bluetooth that can communicate. I think that's a big deal. That's a game changer for not just the consumer, the enterprise user, but also enterprise security. I can walk into an organization. It's not just about the security of my smartphone now. It's about the security of stuff that I wear. And I
that
may
could
just
be used to exfiltrate lots of data.
Absolutely, Ted, right?
Yeah.
Like I can wear my watch and ingest data, ingest code, and exfiltrate code like right on my watch. Now, Apple's ecosystem is very closed, but inevitably when there is a new category or category of products like that created, let's say Apple, for example, is the first one to have LTE on the watch, others are going to follow. What happens when the others allow me to customize that code? That could be spell bad news. I think along those lines, because we're kind of short on time, along those lines are the recent Bluetooth vulnerabilities. And I think these two play together, right? Because if you have a wearable and all of this technology, there are communication protocols like Bluetooth that are going to come into play. And what we just found from Armis, and everything I've researched says that this is legitimate. Now, I personally feel that other people knew about these vulnerabilities. The vulnerabilities in this Bluetooth stack that Armis found, and what are they calling it? Blue something. It was a horrible name. Blue Moon,
Umbrella.
Blue Death. It was just
Blue Born.
It was Blue Born.
Crew.
Blue Born, which is a really bad name in my opinion. Awesome research.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think Armis is the first one to come out with this research. I think others have probably found it and not disclosed it. Armis, I think, is the first one to find it, disclose it to all the vendors because it affects Linux, it affects Android, it affects Windows, it affects iOS, it affects all of these different platforms in that there are potentially remote code execution vulnerabilities in the Bluetooth platform that don't require your devices paired, just requires that you can speak on Bluetooth. This is like the golden Bluetooth vulnerability, which I think in analyzing this and seeing others that I trust in the community post and communicate about this, saying like this is bad, I'm going to follow suit and say this is bad. If they have everything they claim, this is bad. This is really, really a big deal.
So we're coming up with new adaptations of sort of old exploit categories like spoofing, exploit, masquerading. I mean, we're applying it to a different context, but copying the real thing, right?
Pretty much. I mean, this is like the Bluetooth vulnerability that we speculated about 12 years ago when we started looking into Bluetooth security. This is the realization that it's happened. Now, on the flip side of that, if we look at the kind of positive, everyone's Bluetooth, kind of in the same vein of embedded devices and IoT, is slightly different in the fact that you would gain some type of mass exploit to take advantage of this vulnerability or these set of vulnerabilities might be somewhat limited as to everyone's implementation of the different Bluetooth chipsets and drivers for all these different style devices. That's what I can think of similarly to IoT embedded devices, right? So it's somewhat self-limited.
Through obscurity / complexity.
Right.
Right. Yeah. Still, I've read this book before. I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Go ahead.
well, I didn't read the Bluetooth article, so I don't know how much it overlaps in what we were talking about before with multi-factor authentication. But the salient point is authentication and coming up with creative ways of doing positive authentication, which is not a new concept. We're coming up with new ways of doing it, and with every new way of doing it, there's always a way to exploit it. It's a broken record.
Pretty much. Joff,
Ted, do you agree? You're as old as I am.
I wanted to go to Joff, though. Joff, you've researched a lot of Bluetooth and wireless vulnerabilities. What do you think of these recent findings with Blueborn?
Yeah, it doesn't actually surprise me too much. I obviously don't like that they've come out, but Bluetooth, in a way, has similar foundations to the original DARPAnet in that it was entirely built to be a convenience protocol that things would, just work.
Yeah, trust security wasn't a big issue when they developed Bluetooth, right?
Exactly. And so, you look at these piconets that they form as part of the protocol, the personal area networks that become part of that's overlaid on top. The fact that the Bluetooth Service Discovery Protocol was always really, really open. You just query the thing and it gives out information. It was just a matter of time before somebody found, a hole in all this stuff. There's a lot of Bluetooth that just talks before you even authenticate.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't surprise me that enough persistence found, a problem in the code, just like a lot of these things. With the only thing that is a significant differentiator was Bluetooth was absolutely 100% written as a convenience, it shall work all the time as a wireline replacement protocol, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's where we land.
My fear is with Android specifically. In other words, if you don't have a Google device and you're not on the latest operating system that just came out, not only
I
are you
mine today, baby.
Yeah, I patched mine like a week ago, right? Like I went to Oreo, which is the latest Android release, for other reasons. Specifically, one of the ones that just came out was another. What was the other Android vulnerability? Basically, through like a little pop-up, they could do some attacks. What do they call that pop-up, Joff? I thought I had it in my stories here. Facial recognition, maybe I didn't put it in here. I covered it on a previous show, but not only do you have the Bluetooth thing, right, but you got this other overlay. What do they call that? The pop-up that you can do in Android to give you a notification. I forget the name of it, but there's a vulnerability with that as well. And if you're not an Oreo, you're screwed.
Yeah, push notifications.
Yeah, and like how many people are stuck with whatever their carrier has given them? Do you have a Pixel, Joff?
I do. That was actually my primary motivation for going to Pixel.
Yep,
just like yourself, Paul. I was like, I am finished with these telco vendors that are binding me to old versions of the code. I couldn't stand it. Plus the bloatware that different vendors put on the phone.
Those are two great reasons, right? But so many people buy those lower cost Android devices, and it's so vulnerable. They're covered with bloatware, and it's bad, security-wise, bad.
Well, it's kind of like the old MSO 8067. This one's going to stay with us for a while because the code base is going to stay there in these old devices, probably, practically 2-3 years out.
Oh, I spent a lot of time talking about MSO 8067 yesterday. It's still a big deal. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
It's still there, right?
But now go back to Bluetooth. But look at how long those Bluetooth devices are going to be in. Like, what happens with a car? What happens with speakers? There's so many devices that are using Bluetooth today. They're going to be vulnerable to this for so long. It's scary.
You have to buy a new car every 12 to 18 months. It's like, that's just
unless you have a Tesla. And yet, unless you have a Tesla, which Elon Musk will actually push a patch to you for real, live, right? You heard the hurricane story. So Elon Musk pushed a patch to allow the hurricane evacuees to actually have more battery life temporarily, which I thought was absolutely fantastic.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
A couple other stories out there. Elasticsearch servers were hijacked. Amazon Cloud Host's Elasticsearch servers were broken into, hosting point-of-sale malware, which I read as POS malware, which is point of sale, not the other acronym definition. Zerodium is offering $1 million for Tor browser 0 days. Linus Torvalds has come out and says they want attackers to join Linux kernel development, which I also thought was interesting. The DHS has banned federal agencies from using Kaspersky software because it's made in Russia, which I also thought was interesting. Adobe fixes vulnerabilities in Flash, RoboHelp, and Flash Player, as well as Cold Fusion, which are all very popular things we've talked about on the show in the past. There was also a security warning over hospital syringe pumps. There was more news than we could ever have time for to talk about on the show today.
I had a fun article that I put up that I thought tied back to something we were talking about on some episode a couple weeks ago, that there was a recent South Park episode that apparently was triggering a bunch of Alexa and Google Home devices.
Yes.
I thought that was kind of
fun. I didn't hear about that one. I know
great.
A lot of us in the podcasting community have tried to not use the keywords to trigger people's devices, which could be a device in your home or could be your phone itself, as we've had listeners report. So we've tried not to. I think I did use that in this episode, and I apologize. But you can do that for certain, which is kind of interesting as we move into voice activated technology. Very, very interesting. Hospital syringe pumps, also a good article in the show notes as well. Make sure you go check that one out. Very interesting and very scary in the healthcare security front. Also, Microsoft Windows 10, more control over app-level permissions, and a .NET 0 day in the news as well. So, a lot of news to talk about this week. Thank you, Jeff and Joff, for coming on this episode as well. Now, are you both going to be at DerbyCon? Because next week we're not broadcasting because we're going to be at DerbyCon.
DerbyCon.
Absolutely,
yes.
I'll be there.
Okay. Look for dinner invites that are going out. I talked to Sam today. I hope to catch up with our listeners as well as all of us Security Weekly family as well. Ted, are you going to be at DerbyCon?
Unfortunately not. I'm somewhere else. I think I'm in Oslo.
Bummer.
I'm not even sure.
You're
I
a
wish I were
traveling
there,
man.
though.
You're a traveling man. Well, Ted, thank you very much for coming on this episode of Security Weekly. It was nice having you. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you, Paul. My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching to Paul Security Weekly. We will not see you next week because we'll be at DerbyCon. So the week after. Thank you, everyone. Over and out.